What does hip hop, R&B, jazz, rock and roll, soul, and funk all have in common? While they all originated within or by members of the African American community, the term African American has had many different definitions, but the most widely accepted one, and the one I will be using for this video, is a direct descendant of Africans who were enslaved in the US or in any area that became a part of the US. Many times, the term African American refers to all Black Americans in the United States, like people of more recent African migration to the US, but we will not be talking about that community today. The African American population can be traced back as 400 years to the Jamestown colony in modern day Virginia in the year 1619. The origins of the transatlantic slave trade actually goes back to the Portuguese, where in 1526 they completed their first voyage from Africa to what is now Brazil. And from 1526 to 1867, a total of over 12.5 million Africans were taken from their homes, headed to North and South America, with about 10.7 million of them surviving the journey. Of that 10.7 million, about 388,000 ended up in the United States, which may not seem like a lot, but we must note the fact that chattel slavery in what is now the United States lasted for 246 years, up until the year 1865. And the slave population grew tremendously, just like how the population of the US in general also grew tremendously during those almost 250 years. The growth of the slave population had a lot to do with slave breeding through breeding plantations, which was where slave owners forced slaves to have children to increase their own wealth, as slaves were seen as an asset, and to them, the more the better. And by the year 1865, the population went from 388,000 to 4 million enslaved black people in the United States of America. Now, prior to living in the New World and developing their own culture, these African people had their own names, languages, families, and traditions. They were from diverse backgrounds from all over West and Central Africa, but where were they specifically from? Around half of the slaves brought to the US were brought from two specific regions: West Central Africa, meaning what is now Angola, Gabon, the Republic of the Congo, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the other region being Senegambia, which is Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Mali. The rest were made up of slaves from Ghana, Ivory Coast, Cameroon, and Nigeria, which are some countries I will get back to. There was also a smaller population of slaves brought from southeastern Africa, countries like Madagascar. Now, because of the fact that African slaves were brought from all of these different regions, when we look at the genes of modern day African Americans, they are all over the place. There is a lot of genetic and ancestral diversity within African Americans. They are all a mix of all these different regions of Africa with different race depending on the individual. One thing I have realized though is looking at 23andMe results of African Americans, which, disclaimer, I'm not claiming 23andMe is going to be the most accurate. One thing I've realized is Nigeria tends to be quite a large genetic component in modern African Americans, which makes sense because Igbo people were one of the principal ethnic groups during the transatlantic slave trade, as around 15% of all slaves were taken from a region called the Bight of Biafra, which is where Igbo land is located. Yoruba people of Nigeria were also taken during the slave trade, having large cultural and genetic impacts in regions like Brazil. The region of Ghana, Liberia, and Sierra Leone tends to be another quite large genetic component in African American DNA as well. However, I will say that the amount of DNA from these different regions tends to depend on which African American community we are talking about and where in the US they are from. A South Carolinian black person will have different rates of this DNA. They may have very little Nigerian DNA, higher Senegambia DNA, and higher Ghana, Liberia, and Sierra Leonean DNA. Because although most slaves were brought directly to the South, different African populations were brought to different regions of the South because certain skill sets were sought after in different areas. A Gullah Geechee person, which is a group I will definitely have to make a video about later, will have much more Ghana, Liberia, and Sierra Leonean DNA, as the skill set of these people were sought after on the coast. They also tend to have lower rates of European DNA. But in general, it seems that a huge portion of African American DNA is directly from this region of Africa and also this one. These two regions represent dozens of different ethnic groups, and over hundreds of years, modern African Americans became a mix of all these people with ancestral variants, sometimes or most of the time, actually, depending on geography. As slavery went on in America, all of these groups assimilated in a way, and over time developed what became the beginning of the African American identity. It is also important to note that African Americans tend to have 20 to 25% European DNA on average as well. Over hundreds of years in the South, a new culture started to form, a new identity, a new ethnicity, a new language. This was a culture heavily influenced by their shared struggle, African roots, and also America at the time, and especially the South. African American culture came out of necessity, as African slaves were stripped of their names, culture, language, religion, tradition, and well, their entire identity. In this video, I will specifically speak about the language that was developed through African Americans, which is called AAVE or African American Vernacular English, which is a type of English that many Black Americans are portrayed as speaking in the media and became quite quote unquote mainstream through the popularization of rap music in the 80s onward. You know, that dialect that was referred to as Ebonics or even Ganglish, but when it became even more popularized and normalized through media, through the internet, through mediums like TikTok, it was just called TikTok slang or whatever they want to call it. Yes, that language is specifically from the African American community and has developed many different dialects over time, and we can trace the genesis of this language to slavery. There are two theories on how AAVE developed. The first being the Creole theory, which is the theory that AAVE developed as African slaves could not understand each other because of the various ethnic and linguistic groups brought to the USA during the slave trade. So they developed a version of English that, in many ways, was like a broken English, a way for slaves to communicate with each other, with the common language being English. And over time, this pidgin language became a Creole. The second and more accepted theory is the dialect theory, which is that the slaves on the plantations learned their English from people that would be on the plantations, like overseers or indentured servants. These people usually came from poor or immigrant backgrounds, like Irish indentured servants or poor Southerners. And this was the language that the Africans took on. There's also another theory that AAVE started off as a Creole and over time got decreolized as it became more and more in contact with the English being spoken by the white population in the South, and it developed from there. The dialects of English that black slaves were in contact with were varieties of English mostly spoken by white people lower on the socioeconomic ladder. This was a form of English that wasn't really recorded much, but it is thought that this is the form of English that black people adopted and developed in the South. The African element to AAVE is actually heavily debated. Some say there is no African features, and others say that many of the grammatical structures of AAVE are based on African languages. And many of the sounds, like how duh is used many times instead of the, is based on African tones. But then you could just say that this is from other English speaking whites on the plantations, like how Irish use duh instead of the. At this point with AAVE, there is still a lot we don't know about its development. Unlike Caribbean Creole languages, which is used by Black Caribbean people, where we know that the language was created through a pidgin language becoming a Creole and then some decreolization happening after. We don't know if that happened with AAVE, but it is almost certain that it comes from a spoken version of English in the South, taking on many of those characteristics. The language spoken by the Gullah Geechee of the lower Atlantic states, for example, that's a Creole language, right? Their language is actually Creole, just like how Caribbean English is Creole, and it developed in the same way like Patois did, even sounding like those languages.
And I tell you, close the door if you done to it. Whole house smell nanny up. Gay boy, you wangy, Annie. Get your tail in the wash and put up some of this tatsia. Yeah, people talking about me in the street.
By the 1900s, post slavery, AAVE had been established for the most part, with the grammatical structures used in AAVE being cemented in the language. At this point, 90% of African Americans lived in the South. This is where the African American culture, identity, and language originates. From 1910 to 1970, 6 million black people migrated out of the South and went into the West Coast, Midwest, and Northeast of the USA. This was called the Great Migration, having a lot to do with fleeing racial prejudice and violence in the Jim Crow South. Through this migration came the spread of AAVE all throughout the USA. If you've ever wondered why do black Americans from Seattle speak in the same way as black Americans from Alabama or Los Angeles, even though their accents are different, it is because they are speaking AAVE. Another thing you may notice is how African Americans, even outside of the South, like in Chicago or LA, their AAVE may still have like a Southern aspect to the sound. Maybe I'm the only one that's noticed this, but let me know in the comments.
But on game bang, I got a crowd that I follow with. My brother right here, brother, he a black stone. That game bang stuff not in me. I'm getting some money, little dollars.
But if you ever watch like a documentary of these black communities in these cities in the 60s or 70s, you will definitely hear some people with quite Southern accents, even if they're quite far from the South. And this is because of the Great Migration. But it would make sense that if these black communities exist and they retain AAVE, they might retain the Southern sound in many ways. But this amalgamation of Southern AAVE had a huge impact on how black accents from these areas sound. They're very unique compared to like the white populations, for example, in the area. Over time, dialects of AAVE start to exist as a standardized version of this AAVE forms in these black communities. The African American identity is not just a result of history, it's a living, evolving culture forged from struggle, resilience, and creativity. From the forced blending of dozens of African ethnic groups to the adoption and transformation of the English language into African American Vernacular English, to the cultural innovations that gave birth to entire genres of music, African American contributions have shaped not only the United States, but global culture at large. Understanding the story is not just about history, it's about recognizing the foundation of so much of what we call American culture today.